Michael Fomenko, Australia's Tarzan. The eccentric son of a Georgian princess, Michael Fomenko spent decades living wild in the North Queensland jungle. Frank Robson tracks him down. The exotic Michael Fomenko, known across far North Queensland as Tarzan, occupies a sort of mezzanine level between conventional reality and his own imagined world. For almost 60 years, the runaway son of a former Georgian princess and a master at Sydney's Shore School roamed alone in Australia's northern wilderness, testing himself against some of the harshest terrain in the world. Fomenko saw himself as a heroic character from Homer's Odyssey, and grew obsessed with building and sailing dugout canoes. In one, he survived a perilous 600-kilometre voyage from Cookton to Merauke, in today's Indonesian province of Papua. He lived among remote Cape York Aborigines, killed wild boar and crocodiles with a machete, and vanished like a ghost at any sign of officialdom. Fomenko's self-imposed exile divided his family and captured the imaginations of countless Australians, who made him into a living frontier legend. Until a few years ago, the old man was still living in bush hideouts south of Cairns. He emerged occasionally to jog to a nearby town for supplies, his trademark sugar bag over his shoulder, sparking waves of Tarzan sightings among his internet followers. In 2012 all sightings ended, and speculation grew that Fomenko must have died alone in the bush. Then, in September this year, news swept the world that the Aussie Tarzan wasn't dead but living permanently at the Kunda Aged Care Centre in Gympie, 3 hours drive north of Brisbane. He'd been there since late 2012, when he became ill while walking to Sydney supposedly to visit family members. At 85, Fomenko has taken his solitariness indoors. He doesn't speak to other residents at the home, and, after assuring his followers in the north he was okay, declined all requests for interviews. As far as we're aware, he's alone in the world, says Kunda's CEO Robin Cross. He has no visitors and no known family connections? He came to us, from Gympie Hospital, with nothing, not even his sugar bag. He communicates a little with staff, but that's pretty much it. 30 years ago, when he was more voluble, I chanced upon Tarzan at one of his overnight bush camps on Cape York and became one of the few journalists to interview him. Members of his immigrant family later told me the disturbing details of his earlier life, and how his mother's attempts to civilize him ended up having the opposite effect. Cross says that when she realized who Fomenko was, she asked her staff to read my earlier articles about him. If staff raise some of the adventures you wrote about, Michael will sometimes continue the conversation, but at other times, he won't. The one-time champion decathlete has all but lost the use of his legs, yet takes no medication and still exercises compulsively in a wheelchair, propelling himself around Kunda's leafy pathways. Sadly, Fomenko's earlier ordeals with electric shock therapy seem to have led to decades of his life slipping by unnoticed. He said when he arrived here he'd been going to Sydney to visit his parents, says Cross. I told him, from reading your stories, that his parents were both gone, and that he'd attended the funeral of his mother, the former Georgian Princess Elizabeth Macabelli, who died in 1988. But in his mind they're still alive, even now. Tragically, it was Elizabeth Fomenko who set in motion the events that led to her wild man son being hunted down by mounted police on Cape York in the early 1960s. He was then declared insane and locked up in a series of mental institutions, where he endured sedation and electric shock therapy for years before returning to the jungles of Cape York in 1969. Mother insisted on Michael having psychiatric treatment because she never understood his quest for adventure. His sister, Nina Oam, told me before her death in 2008, but I knew he wasn't insane, just different? And nothing they did to him in all the places she had him committed was of any benefit. It just made him more frightened, more of a recluse. Born in Georgia, then part of the Soviet Union, in 1930, Michael and his family fled across the frontier to Manchuria in China in the late 1930s, later moving to Japan before escaping again to Australia in 1941. Michael's father, Daniel, himself an ex-athlete, became a wartime radio commentator and one of Shore's most popular masters. As a Shore pupil, Michael was troubled by language difficulties and feelings of alienation. But he shone as a decathlete and may have represented Australia in the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne if he hadn't suddenly gone bush. It was his father who introduced him to Homer's Odyssey, the Greek epic of endurance and alienation that became the template for his life. "I understand Michael's quest," said Daniel Fomenko before his death in 1960, because his background and experiences epitomize a great tragedy of modern life. In 1985, photographer Arthur Mosted and I came across Tarzan, as he'd been dubbed by kids in the Torres Strait years earlier, camped near the entrance to the Bloomfield River, south of Cooktown. An Aboriginal woman pointed him out, and when we introduced ourselves he rose from the dirt and shook hands formally. "My name's Mr. Fomenko," he said. He wore only shorts and his powerful, leathery frame was dark with ingrained grime. Over the next couple of hours, as night fell and parrots screeched, the famously sweet-toothed eccentric dispensed Coke and chocolate bars, bought from a local store with his disability pension, and spoke erratically of his adventures, regrets and plans. "What's Sydney like now? I do miss it. Yes, I miss dancing and the parties, but I've been having such an adventurous time here. And I've traveled a lot, mostly in my canoe. And I'm still very young. I have learned many wild ways of treating sickness. In the future, if I'm any good, I might become a doctor. I've had plenty of sick, up till now, a lot of introspect, but I don't say I'll live like this for good. I might go back to the city and come back here later. I'm still quite young, you know." He told us several times he missed his mother, then in a nursing home, and how he sent her shells and bar tusks to let her know he was well. Being quite young ourselves, we thought it'd be fun to take Tarzan with us to a hippie party at a nearby property. But he sensibly declined. "I'd like to," he said, "but not tonight. I haven't got time." Soon after this encounter, Nina Oum came to the same area hoping to see her brother for the first time in a decade. Guided by Pearl Kendrick, who'd got to know Tarzan through operating a store at north of Cape Tribulation, Oum went to Obey where he was camping while putting his latest dugout canoe through sea trials. But when they saw him exercising on the beach, and Oum raced down and threw her arms around him, he pushed her aside, saying, "I have to do my exercises." He didn't recognize her, Kendrick told me. When Nina ran after him, he'd whirl and go back the other way. In the end, she gave up. A week later, when they saw him again, Oum wrote on a board, "Michael, this is Nina, your sister. I'm staying with Pearl. Come in," and left it on the beach. Tarzan sent word for her to come to the tree he was living under, and they spent several days together before he abruptly disappeared. Oum told me years later that Elizabeth Fomenko had admitted before her death she'd been wrong to have her son committed. She said she was sorry, she'd made a mistake. The sad thing is that, but for all the enforced treatment, Michael may well have returned and settled down by now. "I think he was running away from a part of himself people couldn't understand, but there was another part of him that would have liked to be ordinary, with a lawnmower and a wife." Perhaps it was that part of Fomenko that set him on his final journey home in 2012. Or perhaps, given his age and the appalling conditions he endured for so long, he'd simply had enough. When Kunda's Robin Cross gently pointed out that his parents would be too old to be still alive, Fomenko responded, "Well, they could both be over 100, and still living." Fomenko had two other sisters, whose whereabouts are unknown. Cross offered to try to find any surviving family members through the Salvation Army, and Fomenko agreed. But when she gathered the necessary documents, and asked him to sign them, he changed his mind. Now the man who grew old without noticing spends most of his waking hours alone in his room, found by the world yet still lost inside himself. By Frank Robson. Put a like under this video, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell and share this video with your friends.